Love and pain. The call came in around 8 in the morning, at least the first call she'd heard. There had been several before this one, nearly every 5 minutes for hours. She had not heard them. She had been dreaming of happier things. It was like her mind wanted to spare her, to let her embrace the last remaining moments of joy before the world shattered and changed forever. The voice on the other end of the line, the voice she had known for all her life, the voice she would recognize anywhere, the voice she loved more than herself, was strong. Behind that strength, she still heard its fear. She still heard terror and pain. She sat up slowly, shaking her head, trying to drown out the words she was hearing. She continued to shake her head with more force and vigor. She hoped that action would wake her, recall her from this unsettling nightmare. She ran her fingers through her hair, then held her head in her hand, resigning herself to the fact that this was real, abandoning her last vestige of hope. The voice begged her to hurry, but to drive carefully. The voice begged her to join him in his pain. She held back her sob while she cried silently and clutched the phone to her ear. She would not show her weakness while he was pretending to be so strong. She knew he felt alone with his grief. He felt as alone as she. She knew in her heart how much he was hurting. She knew the emotions he tried to hide. As she told him she loved him and that she would be there soon, his voice shook and she sobbed. He sniffled on the other end of the line and cleared his throat before speaking. He tried to stay strong as he returned her love. He tried to stay strong, but his voice broke. His voice broke and he cried. She cried harder and clutched the phone more tightly. She cried silent tears. She knew she needed to be strong for him, for herself. She knew this was what he needed. She took a deep breath and wiped her eyes. She held onto the bedpost, then sighed. With a rally of strength, she again said she loved him and told him she was on her way. Without noticing what she was doing, mechanical and blind, she dressed and packed a bag. A sleepy, groggy voice from the bed asked her what she was doing. She tried to ignore the annoyance she heard in that voice. In a detached, robotic reply, feeling far away, she told the sleepy figure what she had learned. The eyes above the voice grew large. Those eyes had experienced a similar pain just months before. Those eyes refused to do so again. Already knowing the answer, she asked her question anyway. Already knowing his reply, she begged. She needed someone with her. She knew she could not drive herself. She begged for him to help her. With a shake of his head, he declined her request. He uttered every excuse he could. With pain and resignation, she turned away. She refused to let him see her cry. Without looking into his eyes, the eyes of selfish self-preservation, she grabbed her bag and said goodbye. He said he loved her and wished her safe travel. He said he loved her and rolled over, onto his side. She nodded and said she loved him too. She nodded and silently questioned those words. She placed her bag in the car, then sat behind the wheel. She leaned her head down and cried. She felt angry and frustrated. She felt sad and alone. She felt more pain than she could tolerate. Punching the steering wheel, she gritted her teeth. She gritted her teeth and resolved to stay strong. As she headed down the road, she put on some music. She hoped for distraction and escape from her pain. As if the universe was laughing at her, as if it rejoiced in her grief, the song on the radio ripped at her heart. It was the song of her pain. Pummeling the off button, she screamed out in anger. She screamed a visceral, animalistic noise. When she reached a red light, she closed her eyes. She saw nothing but redness, felt nothing but blackness. She wished she could feel nothing at all. She breathed in deeply, recalling the strength on the phone, recalling the love 100 miles away. She held on to that strength, that love. She sighed while her eyes were still closed. A frustrated motorist, right behind her, wailed on his horn and shouted for her to go. She took another breath and stared at the light. She saw green and shook her head. He continued to blast his horn into her ears. He shouted words in anger. She wanted to jump out and throttle him. She wanted him to feel her pain. He continued shouting as she glared in the rearview mirror. He shouted still as she placed her foot on the gas. She saw him roll his eyes and make an obscene gesture. She saw red again as the green light disappeared. Abandoning any escape or rescue through music, she tried to drown out her thoughts and pain. She spoke to herself. She spoke words with no meaning. She spoke and refused to cry. 50 miles into her 100-mile voyage, she no longer recognized herself. Something had shifted in the intervening miles. She had grown numb and cold. This scared her, left her breathless. This confused her and made her feel alone. She shook her head, wondering who she was becoming, wondering if she would always be alone. Hoping to regain some sanity and normalcy, she forced herself to picture the face which had made that world-shattering call. She smiled as his face appeared in her mind. She smiled and laughed and cried. She felt the numbness dissipating, the numbness she had thought she needed, the numbness which had frightened her when it had appeared. That numbness wasn't necessary. It wasn't part of who she was. She always felt strongly and deeply. Why change that now? She forced herself to stay with her pain, to feel it, to acknowledge it, to allow the damage it caused. With her permission, it seized her mind and heart. With her permission, it grew. With amazement, she realized it wasn't alone. Attached to that pain was love. Of course, she whispered, love causes pain. She smiled. She smiled because she knew she would never desire to change that. She smiled in acknowledgement of love. The love from the strong voice on the phone returned to her mind. It reached into every corner of her heart. The pain allowed it more room to grow. She smiled and sighed and kept on driving, not noticing she had missed her exit. Instead of cursing and seeing red, she laughed at her distracted mistake. Turning around and gathering her strength, she composed her face before going to meet the one she loved, before going to meet the waiting pain. Standing outside, alone and solitary, was the face and voice she loved. Checking her image in the mirror, willing the fear to leave her eyes, she slowly got out of the car to meet him. She slowly walked to his side. Battling tears, fighting off her grief, she hugged him and spoke no words. He gripped her with the strength she knew he possessed, the strength that was masking his pain. That hug spoke of love, of grief, of understanding. It held a connection which could never be broken. She kissed his cheek while returning his hug. She kissed his cheek with love. He stepped back slowly and released his grip. He stepped back and looked into her eyes. She held her breath while looking back into his eyes, the eyes which were exactly like her own. She squeezed his hand, squared her shoulders. She squeezed his hand so he would know she was strong. She told him she loved him, and he closed his eyes. He closed his eyes to hide his pain. She put her arm around him, and they walked together toward the door. They sighed in unison, in love, in pain. He grabbed her free hand, brought it to his lips, and kissed it. He kissed her hand with love. They paused before the doorway. They both stared down at the ground. She laughed at how alike they were. He grinned at her and chuckled, thinking similar thoughts. They grinned and looked into identical eyes. He sighed and asked her if she was ready. She nodded slowly, holding on to his strength. She nodded, and they stepped through the doorway, stepped through it with love by their sides.